There is indeed a risk that if they do that and people are removed to Rwanda unlawfully, that those people may even be entitled to compensation.
Let's now move on to looking at the policy. Now, the former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick, he resigned as the emergency legislation was being announced. Robert Jenrick's warned that the Conservatives will face the red-hot fury of voters unless they do more to tackle the number of people moving to the UK. I mean, that very much follows on from the conversation we've just had with Richard Tice. Writing in the Daily Telegraph after resigning from the government on Wednesday, Jenrick also says that any suggestion that the legislation will swiftly remove those who arrive in small boats is for the birds. Here's the Prime Minister defending his policy.
What I'm saying, not just to my MPs, but the entire country, is that I share their frustration. Right? My patience with this has worn thin. Right? One of my 5 priorities at the beginning of the year was to stop the boats, and I'm pleased that we've made progress. Down by a third. For the first ever time, by the way. That shows that our plan is working, but we've got more to do. And that's why this legislation is so important. We've got to end the legal merry-go-round that has blocked us from getting our Rwanda scheme up and running. That's what this legislation does. That's what the new treaty that the Home Secretary signed this week does. And it will mean unequivocally that Rwanda is safe and there should be no more blocks to our ability to get people on planes and send them to Rwanda, because that is critical.
Now, the issue is set to come to a head on Tuesday when MPs will get a chance to vote on the plan. But let's see what my next guest thinks about this. Alexander Horne is a leading barrister and visiting professor at Durham University and a former senior parliamentary lawyer. Alexander, welcome to the show. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I read your very interesting Spectator article with great interest. Tell us, what do you make of this from a legal point of view?
I mean, we've got 2 separate things going on here. We've got a treaty and we've got what's been described as emergency legislation. As I said in the article, I think the only emergency that we're talking about here is what's going on in the Conservative Party about their migration policy. But taking these 2 things separately, the treaty is very much addressing the Supreme Court judgment that basically said sending people to Rwanda isn't safe. And it includes some safeguards, probably the most critical one being that people who would be removed to Rwanda, whether or not their asylum claim was successful, couldn't be removed anywhere else other than back to the UK. So that's all well and good up to a point. So let's turn to the legislation. The legislation is much more contentious. It basically says that all decision makers have to treat Rwanda as a safe country. So that's basically saying, look, we don't quite trust this new treaty that we've come up with. We don't trust that the courts will find that that is in and of itself enough. They might still say Rwanda is not a safe country. So we're going to try and stop them from doing that by including what lawyers would describe as an ouster clause, by telling the courts that they can't generally just say that Rwanda is not a safe country anymore and preclude the removal of people. Now, the reason that Mr. Jenrick resigned is because the way that this has been drafted is not going to stop cases coming to court. There are 2 reasons for this. First of all, the new legislation still allows people to challenge their removal if the risk of harm is due to their own individual circumstances. So you can envisage that quite a lot of people might well say, well, I've got particular issues here that mean that I ought not to be sent to Rwanda. The legislation also doesn't stop the courts making what's known as a declaration of incompatibility. Now, that in and of itself wouldn't stop people being removed to Rwanda, but it would say that the legislation is not compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. So if we look at a timeline here, what's likely to happen is that lawyers will challenge this under those 2 particular headings. People may or may not be put on planes. I think the chance of it happening rather remote. And even if the UK courts are precluded from intervening, claimants are then going to go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and say that this is all hugely problematic, at which point, because the legislation is drafted in the way that it does, which will have excluded the courts from looking at some of these issues, the Strasbourg court will look at this. And it's quite likely that they will say that this is hugely problematic. And there is indeed a risk that if they do that and people are removed to Rwanda unlawfully, that those people may even be entitled to compensation.
Right.
So you can see how none of this is going to satisfy anyone. Those people who oppose the scheme, and I must confess, I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it offers value for money, and I don't think morally we ought to be doing it. So, I mean, that's my personal view. But those people that oppose the scheme will say this legislation is draconian and
Yeah.
unconstitutional. And those people that
And
support the scheme will look at it and say, well, it won't have the effect they want.
yes, it's sort of the worst of all worlds for everybody. And, you know, your pieces, I really do urge people to read it. It's a really, really interesting and very clearly set out piece. And of course, there's many ironies in this. You know, the bill is basically kind of asking any domestic court or tribunal to sort of just ignore any interim measure made by the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, the irony is that the Rwandan government has said that they'll walk away if you know, the UK is in breach of its international legal obligations. And of course, you make the point as well that in the very unlikely event that the bill does pass through Parliament unscathed, and of course it will have a lot of trouble, not just in the Commons, but definitely in the Lords, it does leave the courts in a quandary, doesn't it? Because it sets a very difficult precedent, you know, at worst, it encourages other countries to believe that they can simply ignore international obligations. I mean, we're kind of off the reservation at this point in terms of international law, surely.
I agree with that entirely. I think that this is a very unfortunate measure because it puts the court in a position where, if it follows, as I think it must, the notion of parliamentary sovereignty and does what the bill says it does, then there's a risk that people are then subject to removal. If interim measures are made, and the bill doesn't preclude the UK complying, but essentially now says that ministers make the final decision, so the courts can't have regard for any interim measures that are made in Strasbourg,
Okay.
then if those are ignored by ministers, that would be a breach of international law. And then you'd have a case going to Strasbourg, where I think it would be inevitable if the UK is pursuing measures of this sort that the Strasbourg court would find against us.
Okay.
Now, it's also worth mentioning this isn't all about the European Convention on Human Rights. There is this issue that some people are now saying, oh, well, we should leave that as well. But it's worth recalling the Supreme Court judgment originally listed a whole range of international laws, including the Refugee Convention, the United
Okay.
Nations Convention Against Torture, and all of these other measures that we now seem to be trying to
Okay.
ignore.